Beneath the surface of almost every human life runs a quiet dread, the fear of being rejected. Not just overlooked, but dismissed, judged, found unworthy. It is a fear so subtle yet so powerful that it shapes entire destinies. Careers are pursued not for passion, but for safety. Friendships are prolonged long after they've withered, simply because solitude feels like a verdict. Even love itself often becomes less a meeting of souls and more a fragile bargain for approval. And yet, Carl Jung reminds us that the sting of rejection does not come from the crowd alone. Its true origin lies within. What unsettles us most about a no from another is the echo it awakens inside, the voice of our own shadow, whispering what we have already denied about ourselves. This is why rejection cuts so deeply. It is never only external judgment, but an internal reminder of the parts of us still unseen, still unclaimed. But something shifts the moment we turn towards this fear rather than flee it. For when rejection is no longer terrifying, everything changes. Masks loosen, authenticity awakens, and even life's refusals begin to reveal themselves as teachers. The terror of being cast aside gives way to a quieter strength, the strength of someone who no longer lives at the mercy of approval. And so the journey begins here, in Jung's territory of the unseen, the shadow behind rejection. Rejection is never just the act of another turning us away. It is an unveiling, a mirror that reflects back what the psyche has long buried. Carl Jung described this hidden terrain as the shadow, the repository of traits, impulses, and sensitivities we deemed unworthy of daylight. Within it lie the forgotten cries of childhood, the shamed gestures, the moments when tenderness was mocked or when strength was demanded too soon. To fear rejection, then, is to fear the exposure of this hidden self, as though another's glance might unlock a door we ourselves keep bolted. Consider the man who dreads being called fragile. His anxiety in social settings does not arise because others are ruthless, but because the word fragile touches a nerve he has spent years numbing. Or the woman terrified of seeming unworthy of love. It is not merely a partner's disapproval that unsettles her, but the long internal narrative whispering that affection must always be earned. Rejection cuts deepest where the blade of the inner critic has already left its mark. Modern psychology echoes Jung's insight. Studies in affective neuroscience reveal that social rejection lights up the same neural pathways as physical pain, particularly in the anterior cingulate cortex. The brain cannot distinguish between the sting of a wound on the skin and the sting of exclusion from the group. Yet those with greater self-acceptance show reduced activation in these regions. When the shadow is reconciled, the outer no fails to pierce so sharply. This suggests that the true battlefield is not in the social sphere, but within the architecture of the self. Jung believed that individuation, the process of becoming whole, required turning toward the shadow, with a willingness to embrace its contradictions. What we repress does not disappear. It governs us invisibly. Only by integrating the unwanted parts of ourselves can rejection lose its tyrannical power. A denial from another does not feel like proof of deficiency when we no longer live in denial of our own complexity. This is why many of history's most luminous figures seemed strangely resilient to the opinions of others. They were not insulated by arrogance, but by wholeness. Their shadows, though still present, had been acknowledged, and so no external judgment could unravel them. Rejection, when faced without fear, becomes a passing breeze rather than a storm. And here the path turns. For if reconciliation with the shadow loosens rejection's grip, what follows is the possibility of living less for appearances and more for truth. It is here that Jung's idea of the persona, the social mask we wear, comes into focus. and with it the greater question of whether one can ever choose authenticity over approval. If this content is resonating with you, consider subscribing. I make videos that help you see the world and yourself more clearly. Thank you. The human being does not enter the world naked, but soon learns to clothe itself in masks. Jung named this the persona, a carefully shaped image presented to society, woven out of expectation and fear. To wear the mask is not in itself a deception. It is a necessary adaptation, a way of functioning within the collective. But when the mask hardens, when the self begins to confuse its own reflection with its essence, the individual becomes enslaved. The fear of rejection is what keeps the mask in place, for to let it slip is to risk the exposure of what lies beneath. History is filled with portraits of those who could not tolerate the fragility of their inner world, and so they perfected the agreeable smile, the obedient posture, the unthreatening voice. They became what was expected: the dutiful student, the loyal employee, the companion who never disrupts. Approval became their currency, and like all currencies, it demanded constant expenditure. Yet no matter how much was spent, a quiet poverty of authenticity remained. Modern psychology observes this too. The phenomenon of self-discrepancy, identified by E. Torrey Higgins, describes the psychological strain created when one's actual self diverges from the ideal self or the self imposed by others. The result is anxiety, shame, and exhaustion. A life lived in service to an image rather than to the soul. Fear of rejection amplifies this discrepancy. It makes people cling to the persona as if survival depended on it. But what is survival without truth? Those who loosen their grip on approval discover a strange liberation. To speak a thought without calculating its reception, to follow a path without first securing applause, to love without bending into contortions for acceptance, these acts do not abolish rejection, but they strip it of terror. Rejection may come, yet it does not shatter identity, for identity no longer rests upon another's nod. Jung saw this as the slow unfolding of individuation, the alignment of the outer life with the inner necessity. Consider the great artists whose originality was mocked before it was revered, or the thinkers whose ideas were exiled before they were celebrated. Their authenticity was not rebellion for spectacle, but fidelity to an inner law. They endured rejection because they had already refused the greater betrayal, the betrayal of themselves. And here lies the paradox. Only when fear of rejection loosens does rejection reveal its hidden face. It ceases to be an enemy and begins to act as a guide, a teacher pointing away from false belonging and toward deeper alignment. What seems at first a wound often conceals a message. The dismissal by others may in fact be the psyche's redirection. Which brings us into the next terrain. The recognition that even in its sting, rejection bears within it a hidden gift. Every rejection contains within it a double face, one that wounds and another that whispers. On its surface, rejection appears as a door closed, a path denied, a voice saying, "You are not enough." Yet beneath that sting is often a deeper message from the psyche itself, stripping away illusions and nudging the individual toward greater alignment. Jung understood suffering in this way, not as meaningless cruelty, but as the soul's attempt to communicate. The loss of a relationship, the refusal of an employer, the silence of an audience, these may sting less because of what they deny, and more because of what they expose about our own projections. When a heart longs for affection and is denied, the rejection compels one to question. Was it the person who was truly sought, or the image of salvation cast upon them? When a career dream falters, the failure often reveals that the pursuit was less about vocation and more about borrowed ambition, a striving to meet the invisible demands of family, culture, or ego. Rejection peels away the disguise, leaving behind a clearer outline of what belongs authentically to the self. Contemporary psychology speaks of cognitive reappraisal, the ability to reinterpret painful experiences in ways that reduce distress and increase resilience. Research shows that individuals who learn to reframe rejection as information rather than condemnation cultivate greater adaptability and long-term success. In Jungian language, this is nothing less than the psyche using difficulty as a compass, pointing away from false identities and toward the deeper ground of the self. This perspective changes the texture of rejection. No longer merely a dismissal, it becomes a kind of tutor, severe but honest. To be rejected by a lover can awaken the neglected work of self-acceptance. To be turned away from a role can free energy for a vocation closer to the soul's design. Even the smallest exclusions in daily life remind the individual not to seek wholeness in mirrors, but to discover it inwardly. It is telling that many of those who later reshape culture, thinkers, innovators, visionaries, carry within their biographies a long record of refusals and setbacks. What distinguishes them is not immunity to rejection, but an alchemical transformation of it. What was once felt as exile becomes fuel for creation. What once seemed like loss reveals itself as redirection. And yet, rejection is not only personal, it also speaks to the broader bond between the individual and the collective. For behind every dismissal lies the silent power of the group, the herd whose acceptance or disapproval often decides whether one conforms or dares to walk alone. It is here, at the threshold where personal rejection meets collective belonging, that Jung's warnings about the mass mind come into focus. And so the next question arises: what does it mean to live when the fear of exclusion no longer chains one to the herd? To live free of the herd is not to turn one's back on humanity, but to stand differently within it. Jung saw clearly that the collective mind is both shelter and prison. It offers belonging, yet often at the price of individuality. Fear of rejection is the tether that binds people to its rhythms, the constant need to be accepted, liked, approved, and never cast aside. But when that fear begins to dissolve, something profound occurs. A person discovers that solitude is not the absence of company, but the presence of self. The mass mind thrives on imitation. It rewards those who repeat its gestures, speak its phrases, and bend to its norms. In the modern age, this is amplified by the architecture of social media, where the price of visibility is often conformity. Algorithms echo the herd's desires, amplifying sameness while silencing divergence. Yet history reminds us that the voices who carried culture forward, whether philosophers, artists, or visionaries, were seldom the ones who fit neatly into the chorus. Their strength was not in rebellion for its own sake, but in refusing to betray their inner compass, even when it meant facing rejection from the majority. Psychological research affirms what Jung intuited. Studies on social belonging show that while exclusion triggers the brain's pain centers, those who cultivate strong internal identity markers, values, purpose, self-acceptance, experience reduced dependency on group validation. Independence of thought does not eliminate the discomfort of rejection, but it creates resilience against it. The individual no longer dissolves into the collective. They can withstand misunderstanding without surrendering their truth. This is not a call to isolation. To transcend the herd is not to abandon community, but to inhabit it differently, to contribute without being consumed, to belong without being owned. It is a paradox. The one who ceases to beg for acceptance often becomes the one most capable of genuine connection. For independence commands respect in a way that dependence never could. And so, the journey that began with the shadow and moved through authenticity and rejection's hidden gift, culminates here, in the quiet strength of individuation. A life not governed by the tremors of exclusion, but by an inner gravity that cannot be taken away. Perhaps this is the real question worth lingering on. What shifts in a human life when fear of rejection no longer dictates its course? What becomes possible when solitude is no longer terror, but ground? Share your reflections below, because in speaking them, you may discover that what once felt like exile is, in truth, the first step toward freedom.